everybody. Welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Monday, October 27th, where we are talking about Dracula and also finishing up with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And of course, I wanted to remind you about our first paper. So I'll start with paper number 1, which is going to be due this Wednesday, ideally. As you know, I have rolling deadlines so that you could submit in the paper after this date, but certainly keep me apprised at this point if you don't have your paper, because we are approximately midway through the semester. And you can send your paper via PDF, which is how my grading program works best, to my email, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. Getting quite a few papers back at this point, so you might need to wait a little bit. So I like to tell students you're in the queue, but definitely you will get it back with my comments on it and a grade, and you definitely have the opportunity to rewrite it for a higher grade, taking my comments into account. I just ask that you submit in the revision along with the original with my graded commentary, and that you consult with me if you're not sure how to proceed, and you submit that in to me by the ending of the semester, so you've still got plenty of time. We were talking about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and just some closing commentary that most people sort of think of it as a kind of dual personality, but the text is much more complex than that. I know that in popular culture, the term Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is used in that way. And the point of the entire novel is that these are not two separate individuals, but they're basically one, and they are unable to accept each other. And this directly is a commentary on the repressive Victorian society of the time, where one had to maintain a certain level of respectability, or one was part of the seedy underground, and there was no in between. And the inability to merge both of these individuals is what we see with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And keep in mind that Mr. Hyde always existed within Dr. Jekyll. What he tried to do was to separate that out, and we see the negative consequences of that. In Stevenson's novella, even the table of contents, I think, are quite interesting. And the story of the door, as I was suggesting, that doors are so important in terms of entrances and exits, especially if we're talking about the psyche, or the search for Mr. Hyde, and we talked a little bit about the way Hyde could represent Hyde, Hide, as individuals are trying to hide their baser needs and desires. And of course, what we also see is that a hide, Hyde, is an animal skin, and we see the descent into the bestial, kind of reverse Darwinism is what I was recommending. And Dr. Jekyll was quite at ease in the idea of Doctor as supposed to bring respectability. And the idea of Jekyll, and which means icicle, I think works nicely as well in terms of some of the possible sexual commentary in the text. We're never told specifically what the ills are that Dr. Jekyll engages in, but we can certainly speculate. And in a very male centric novel, one of the speculations is that he's trying to bury his sexuality. The Carew murder case, and this is a mystery story as well as a supernatural tale. The incident of the letter, we know that ultimately the epistolary novel is quite common in Gothic literature, and we see how once again we get a narrative embedded in a narrative. The incident of Dr. Lanyon and the incident at the window. Again, we aren't given many details about what happens, but ultimately what we see is a Dr. Jekyll who increasingly isolates himself from society. Of course, The Last Night, and we know that that is wonderful in terms of Gothic setting. Dr. Lanyon's narrative. So now ultimately we're going to get a story within a story, as we see with Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case. So, in terms of where we are, we're headed towards the longest text of the semester, which happens to be Dracula, and we are also straddling Halloween. So, what I wanted to do was just to introduce Dracula briefly and then give you the rest of the class so that you could work on your paper. And in terms of Dracula, this is one of those, again, iconic texts. I dare you to go to a Halloween party and not see a Dracula somewhere. And Dracul is the son of the devil, translated, a cruel Romanian medieval conqueror who would impale his victims. And Bram Stoker, in a stroke of brilliance, basically named his vampire Dracul or Dracula, the son of, and ultimately that became part of our popular culture, especially because of, once again, film and the 1930s Universal film. Now, there was a serial killer in the 1500s by the name of Countess Bathory, who would bathe in the blood of young girls to try to get eternal youth. So that probably inspired Stoker as well. When we were talking about Frankenstein, we talked about that great ghost story competition that basically led to Mary Shelley writing the great creation scene of Frankenstein. That ghost story competition also led to a Dr. Polidori writing a short story called The Vampire, which we think also influenced Bram Stoker. One of the earliest instances of vampirism in the United States, New England, since we formed in England, that was new here, was in 1793 in Vermont, no less, basically our backyard. And many of the symptoms associated with vampirism, being very pale and frail, oftentimes were the same symptoms that you would find with tuberculosis and or consumption as it was known at the time. And as we know, if someone was buried prematurely, and this was a legitimate fear or pose, and they tried to work their way out of their grave, you could see how those elements could be connected with the vampire myth. Now, I had suggested that you might want to approach this book as separate books just because of its length. And I think of it as 4 different texts. Book 1, and that's approximately chapters 1 through 4. It's about the actual vampire. And for those who like supernatural tales, that will appeal to that demographic. Part 2, or book 2 as I call it, approximately chapters 5 through 16, is basically a romance story. So for those of you who like romances, then that would appeal to that demographic. Book 3, Mina's Mystery, as I call it. This would be chapter 17 through 23. So if you like mystery genre, and of course mystery is very closely related to Gothic, then that would be the book that would appeal to you. And then lastly, what I call book 4, chapters 22 through 25, an adventure chase story, in effect. I think it was very clever of Stoker to do this because he could appeal to a lot of different kinds of audience members. And we will once again see the epistolary novel as we saw with Frankenstein. This time we'll see it done not just through letters, but through journals and also scrapbooks and newspaper clippings. You can think of it as the social media of the day, I suppose, the way people would document their lives. So the 1931 film, of course, with Bela Lugosi has forever cemented Dracula into public consciousness. And by the way, Bela Lugosi learned his role phonetically. It's one of the reasons why he's got that stilted language, I want to suck your blood, which he never says, by the way. And the first screen adaptation of Dracula was an unlicensed bootleg adaptation of Nosferatu. And if you know that great silent film from 1922, it's a classic in German Expressionism. And one of the things that will be interesting is that that iconic version of Dracula that Bela Lugosi cemented is somewhat different than the version we read about in the text. We've seen this before in other texts, for instance, Frankenstein. It was a Broadway stage play initially before it moved into film, And some of the conventions of the stage play transferred over into film and have become iconic, such as the stiff collar, for instance, which was a stage device, so that an actor on stage would be standing over a trap door. So when this actor needed to disappear, as vampires are supposedly able to do, the costume would be rigged up in such a way so that the actor could slip out of the costume unseen into the trapdoor and disappear. What you would be left with is a standing cape with that stiff collar. And of course, that's part of what we think of when we think of the vampire outfit with the standing collar. And you will see that the film, as oftentimes films do, collapses the text. The text is very long, so obviously it would need to be collapsed, and it tends to simplify the text, as we've seen before. This is considered to be the first American horror film, Dracula. So even though Frankenstein was written first, which is why we talked about it, the film Dracula came out before the 1930s iconic film Frankenstein. If you're curious to know what is considered to be the first horror film, that would be the German expressionist, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which I talk about in my horror film class, which, by the way, is going to be offered in the spring semester online if you are a horror film aficionado. That's CMN 201. One of the things that's interesting about the Dracula film, well, there are many things that are interesting about the Dracula film. Originally, it had no soundtrack, so it's a very eerie kind of silence that I think is quite effective. Of course, you can see versions where they've had soundtracks added, but initially it had no soundtrack. The sets, majestic, very Gothic. So when we talk about the idea of the architecture of the Gothic, then you can think about things like these sets that are reminiscent of Gothic cathedrals. And one might say that Dracula's castle is very cathedral-like in some respects. But of course, this is very Christian text, and Dracula represents that which is anti-Christianity. But more on that later. But you'll definitely see lots of Christian imagery, both in the film and also in reading the text. And for the film, according to film code, the monster is destroyed at the end. The idea that good had to prevail over evil. So normally we would watch Dracula next class, but our next class is the last class before Halloween. And if you're looking on our course outline, you can see that it is called Halloween class. I didn't want to say a whole lot about it, just that I have something planned for Halloween. So hopefully it will amuse and entertain as well as inform. So what we will do is after our Halloween classes that we will see Dracula. And then of course we will talk about the text. So that gives you a little bit of time to read it, especially if you're still working on paper number 1, which ideally would be due on Wednesday, the 29th, this upcoming Wednesday. Again, send via PDF to my email, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And because chances are you're working on your paper, there's no attendance question today, so you can focus on paper number 1. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And next class, we'll talk a little bit about Halloween. Take care. Bye-bye.